Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. In this video, I want to take issue with the outspoken Canadian Conservative member of the House of Commons, Ms. Michelle Rempel's claim that the current Canadian federal budget deficit is a huge one. Granted that the $18 billion estimated deficit for this fiscal year from April 2018 to March 2019 is large, compared especially to the surpluses that Canada enjoyed in a budgetary sense from about 1997 to 2008, which was the most recent period when its national debt actually declined. And especially as a percentage of its gross domestic product. However, I'm not sure if Ms. Rempel had studied this issue, or whether because of the need to post short and sharp and to the point and reasonably attractive videos, or then for an all too common human vice, telling the people who support you want to get, and this happens not just in politics but in many other areas of life, a selective part of the truth, the part that is likely to appeal to them, to your advantage, instead of telling the full truth, because then you would have to recognize that even your opponents have at least sometimes got things right. Ms. Rempel should tell her viewers that neither the currently federally ruling Liberals nor the currently federally federal official opposition Conservatives is innocent of Canada's debt problem. She also should put it in an international perspective. That is what I have noticed in at least some of her videos, also in her videos criticizing the current Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, of worsening Canada's crisis with these illegal immigrants, putting them in hotels apparently on a permanent basis or for an undetermined period of time in the Toronto region. And yes, Canada does have a problem with refugees and with undocumented would-be immigrants and would-be refugees. But is Canada one of the worst countries on the face of the earth with this problem? No. Already Europe, especially its southern countries such as Spain, Italy, and Greece, have probably proportionate to their populations, especially Spain and Italy and Greece, a much worse refugee problem than Canada. Yet, for some reason, Ms. Rempel does not mention this, and that Canada's refugee crisis, which is real, is a part of a huge worldwide problem with refugees. Some 60 million people are now classified on the face of the earth as refugees, according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. The problem is among the worst in Europe, where many people from Western Asia, commonly known as the Middle East, especially Syria, because of its ongoing and still unresolved civil war, are streaming there. And unfortunately, they include a number of affiliates or even members of the Islamic State terrorist organization, who want to pose as innocent would-be refugees, while actually they want to recruit people mostly of Muslim background and Muslim majority nations, immigrant communities, into their ranks. Compared to Europe's refugee crisis and crisis of undocumented would-be immigrants and would-be refugees, Canada's refugee crisis is fairly manageable. Ms. Rempel must be aware of the fact that one major European country now is facing a potential federal cabinet crisis because sister wings of the leading center-right party, the Christian Democrats, disagree over what to do with the refugees. The Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany, Mrs. Angela Merkel, who has been in office since November 2015, favors a more gradual approach, while her cabinet colleague, maybe the Interior Minister Horst Seehofer of the Bavarian Christian Social Union, which is regarded as the Christian Democrats' more conservative wing, favors a more radical approach. In other words, the quicker and more massive deportation of those would-be refugees than Mrs. Merkel favors. And Canada, of course, does not exist in a vacuum. No country does. Also, if we get back to this video's main topic, Ms. Rempel should compare Canada's state of public or gross debt with that of its southern neighbor, the United States. If Canada's $18 billion projected deficit for this fiscal year is called huge, what are we to say of the United States' projected federal budget deficit of over $1 trillion US? Horrendous, I would call it. Humongous, gargantuan. And if the Canadian federal cabinet, now composed of the majority party of the House of Commons, the Liberals have no real plan for balancing the federal budget anytime soon, and the Conservatives allegedly have one. In the United States, neither one of the two main political parties, neither the ruling Republicans nor the opposition Democrats, have produced, as far as I know, any credible plan this century, or at least for the last several years, for even having the huge, or I'm sorry, the gargantuan US federal budget deficit, let alone reducing it by 2/3, 3/4, or 5/6, or 9/10, or getting rid of it altogether. Apparently, they don't care. At least not enough. Or they in principle said that yes, we eventually want to at least significantly reduce the deficit, but then they are unwilling to cut the rate of federal spending radically, which would absolutely have to be done. Nor are they willing to raise taxes significantly, which would sooner or later have to be at least phased in. So compared to the United States' horrendous and gargantuan over $1 trillion projected deficit for this fiscal year, Canada's $18 billion deficit, even allowing for the disparity, rather huge disparity in the sizes of those two countries' economies, is relatively manageable. While the US budget deficit is so huge that apparently politicians on both sides of that country's national legislature or federal legislatures or congresses, apparently they just assume that the United States will be able to just keep borrowing, spending its way out of recession, spending its way out of prosperity and whatnot. In Canada, yes, also some or even several or many painful cuts will have to be made by the next federal government, whether it will be a liberal or a conservative one, but by no means as drastic and painful as in the United States. And is Ms. Rempel aware of the fact that from 1997 to 2008, when Canada consistently reduced its federal debt, and of course the federal debt's percentage as size as percentage of its gross domestic product, for most of those years Canada was governed by the Liberals. First under Jean Chrétien until his retirement in 2006, and then under Paul Martin until his election defeat in 2006. And in came the Conservatives under Stephen Harper during his prime ministership of over 9 years, from February 2006 to November 2015. Canada experienced, at least according to Justin Trudeau and Thomas Mulcair in one of the 2015 Canadian federal election debates, 2 recessions. In other words, they were accusing Prime Minister Harper of being the first Canadian Prime Minister, at least in modern history, who would have to say which one or ask which one when accused of leading the country to a recession. Well, this may well have been partisan rhetoric. And then, according to the Fraser Institute, whose helpful PDF file I found through Google, and which I would definitely recommend to Ms. Rempel if she should watch, for example, this video, for almost 3/4 of the 150 years since Canada became a self-governing dominion and confederation, still under the British Empire's nominal rule, in 1867 to 2017, nearly 3/4 of those 150 years, or approximately 110 if we want to round it off to a nice rememberable number, have been years of federal budget deficits. And surely during that time, both the Liberals and the Conservatives, or as they were known from 1942 to 2003, the Progressive Conservatives had their share of power. So neither one of the 2 political parties, the Liberals or the Conservatives, the main successor of the former Progressive Conservatives, can claim that they and only they have been fiscally prudent, and the other major party and only it has been fiscally irresponsible. That just isn't true. Ms. Rempel should also remind the voters of the fact that from 1973 to 1996, every single Canadian federal budget was a deficit budget, according to this well-researched PDF document compiled by the Fraser Institute. Every single one. Which parties were in power during that time? The Liberals until 1979, then the Conservatives during that 9-month period from June 1979 to March 1980, then again Liberals from 1980 to 1984, then again Progressive Conservatives from 1984 to 1993, and since 1993 again the Liberals. In fact, I can remember from the summer of 1993, was it in June or July of that year, I returned to Finland in early August 1993 after a 6-year immigration in Canada, or to Canada. I either watched on the Canadian television news or heard on the CBC radio broadcast that during the first 2 months of that fiscal year, according to estimates, Canada's federal government had been $8 billion in the red. In other words, the annual projected budget deficit would have been $48 billion. It was lower. According to the Fraser Institute's document, the highest federal budget deficit at that time was $39 billion in 1992. And of course, they wanted to adjust the dollars to constant dollars instead of the inflated ones. The federal debt has increased, according to a Wikipedia article on the public debt of Canada, for, well, most of the period when Canada has been a confederation. This article says, and I quote, Canada's federal debt grew steadily between 5% and 10% per year until 1975. Then, from 1975 to 1987, it grew on average by over 20% per year. And during that time, both the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives were in power. They alternated. I can still remember from my economics course. Could it have been in the school year 1989 to 1990 or 1990 to 1991? Either one probably. At a high school in Thunder Bay, Ontario, where I was living as an immigrant, our teacher showed us a simplified chart of the federal budget deficits during Brian Mulroney's governments. I can still remember that they were either over $30 billion or 30 billion or just slightly under. In 1 year, slightly under. And he said that they don't seem to be able to get below $30 billion. And this was either at the end of the 1990s or either at the end of the 1980s or at the start of the 1990s. So, in my opinion, sometimes Ms. Rempel in those videos lacks an in-depth historical perspective and seems to lack, to some extent, an in-depth international comparison. Maybe because she badly wants to help her party, the Conservatives, to defeat the Liberals in the next federal election, which is due to be held in October 2019. Maybe because if she did that, she would have to give the ruling Liberals some credit for the fact that at least they have been able to keep the deficit at a reasonably low level compared to the just horrendous and gargantuan right through the roof level of the United States. And besides, Ms. Rempel should also acknowledge the fact that from 2008 to 2013, when interestingly her party, the Conservatives, were in power, the federal debt grew by over $144 billion. I'm trying to find the quote here. Which meant over $28 billion per year. And yet an $18 billion budget deficit, in her opinion, is a huge one. So I'm not posting this video, I'm not filming it in order to attack Ms. Rempel, but I'm just trying to politely advise her to tell the full story to the voters. She appears to be a straight-talking, honest politician, or at least for someone whose passion is politics, a reasonably honest person. But in this case, I think that she's telling a rather selective part of the story. I'm trying to find those figures now. Let's see. And actually, the 1995 Canadian federal budget, which of course was prepared by a former finance minister, Paul Martin Jr., was credited by Fraser Institute in this PDF document for starting the process whereby Canada then enjoyed a long period of balanced or even surplus budgets. Of course, that alone did not solve it, because Canada also needed to have a buoyant, quickly growing economy. Yeah. So by 1997, there was a fiscal surplus of nearly $3 billion, and the years 1997 to 2007 saw 11 consecutive budget surpluses. And during most of those years, the Liberals actually formed the federal cabinet, ranging from a low of about $2.96 billion in 1997 to 98 to a high of about $19.89 billion in 2000 to 2001. Deficits unfortunately returned because of the worldwide recession, starting in 2008 to 2009, with a $5.76 billion deficit. I'm rounding them off to the nearest two decimals. Followed in 2009 to 2010 by the largest deficit in absolute terms in Canadian history, about $55.6 billion. That, Ms. Rempel, that is a huge deficit. And the current federal budget deficit pales in comparison to it. It's only 1/3 of that figure. And then subsequent years saw deficits of about $33.37 billion, $26.28 billion, $18.42 billion, and then $5.15 billion before, in the year fiscal year 2014 to 2015, Canada's federal government was able to have a tiny $1.91 billion surplus. However, when this document was prepared, the period from 2015 to 2017 was projected to be one of deficits, as the 2016 Federal Fall Economic Statement, produced by the Department of Finance of Canada, forecast deficits of $1 billion, $25.1 billion, and $27.8 billion. So, Ms. Rempel, I would really like you, should you watch this video, to tell the full story about the Canadian debt crisis, put it in an in-depth historical perspective, and acknowledge the fact that both your party, the Conservatives, and their predecessors, or main predecessors at the governmental level, the Progressive Conservatives and the Liberals, have had a history of often living beyond their means at the federal level. And your party had better than show that it has learned this history lesson, which is an important one from a financial point of view. And then you should also compare Canada's deficit as a percentage of its GDP and Canada's public or gross debt as a percentage of its GDP to that of other major industrialized countries, not the least the United States. So instead of claiming that the Liberals are fiscally irresponsible, you should say both they, the Liberals, and we, the Conservatives, have been fiscally irresponsible, but now we promise to do better than the Liberals and hold us accountable. Don't re-elect us should we be elected in 2019. Don't re-elect us in 2023 if we fail to reduce the deficit to any significant extent, let alone to balance the budget. But then you should not offer, and your party should not offer to the Canadians what so many politicians offer, and let's face it, people in many other areas of life. Many kinds of goodies, increased benefits, without any credible plan on how to pay for them. So this is something that should absolutely and clearly be said. So from 2008 to 2013, I at last found this quote: the accumulated Canadian federal budget deficits totaled about $144.57 billion. And the net debt rose from about $525.21 billion to $686.96 billion, and the Conservatives were in power at the federal level during those years. Granted, until their victory in the May 2011 federal parliamentary elections, they had a minority government, and they had to make deals with the opposition parties, I assume mainly with the Liberals and New Democrats, because the Bloc Québécois, with its intention of splitting Quebec from the rest of Canada, hardly is a party with whom to make those deals. These, of course, are nominal figures, and when adjusted for inflation and population growth, the period from 1973 to 1995 represents the more critical growth of the federal debt. In the constant 2014 dollars, the net debt per capita in Canada rose from $5,971 in 1973 to $30,255 in 1995, an increase of 407%. Between 2008 and 2013, the real per capita net debt rose from $17,182 to $19,758, an increase of 15%. The ratio of net debt to GDP rose between 1973 and 1995 from 20.4% to 72.8%, whereas between 2008 and 2013 it rose from 32.7% to 35.6%. The federal government was fortunate in that there was that 11 surplus budget period from 1997 to 2007, and that interest rates were at historic lows and debt service charges did not further complicate their fiscal problems. In 2000, when the Liberals were in power at the federal level in Canada, public debt charges were still nearly 25% of federal budget expenditure, but by 2015, when the Conservatives were in power for most of the year, they had dropped to 10%. And well, if we take the composition of the federal government's revenue and expenditure in 2015, I assume in the fiscal year 2015 to 2016, so somewhat outdated one, personal income tax still formed over 48% of the revenues, corporate income tax almost 14%, general sales tax over 11%, then employment insurance contributions over 8%, other consumption taxes almost 4%, customs duties over 1%, investment income under 1%, other revenue over 10%. That year, Canada's total revenues were at the federal level over $282 billion. The total expenditures in that fiscal year were over $280 billion. Major transfers to persons included over 27% of the expenditures, of course, unemployment insurance, pensions, probably family allowances and so forth. Then ministries over 25%, major transfers to other levels of government, meaning the provincial and municipal ones, over 22%. Then other transfers over 12%, public debt charges over 9%, crown corporations or federally owned corporations over 2%. The new equalization formula brought into place since 2007, when the Conservatives were in power at the federal level, was a significant reform. Its major features are the reversion to a national average standard of all 10 provinces rather than just the 5 middle-income provinces, and a significant reduction in the number of revenue categories to be equalized from 33 to 5. Personal income tax, business income tax, consumption tax, property tax, and natural resources, with only 50% of provincial resource revenues to be included to minimize Alberta's effect. By 2015, Ontario and Quebec, Canada's two most populous and two richest provinces, together accounted for 68.5%, or over 2/3 of equalization, reflecting their relatively poorer economic performance and weakening fiscal capacity during the period from 2000 to 2015. And the period from 1996 to 2007, when the Liberals were in power until 2006, and then the Conservatives until 2015, the Liberals again since 2015, as generally an era or time period of fiscal success for the Canadian federal government, given the elimination of the deficit, although it was a temporary one, and deficits returned already in the fiscal year 2008 to 2009. Successive balanced budgets, but only until 2007 to 2008. The reduction in the federal expenditure footprint, generally lower corporate income tax rates, and the steep reduction in the ratio of net debt to GDP, that is from 1997 to 2008. So some thoughts from the conclusion of this lengthy document. When Canada became a confederation in 1867, it had a federal budget of $14 million, an expenditure to GDP ratio of approximately 5%, and a net debt of $75.7 million. So this resulted in a ratio of net debt to GDP of 20% and annual interest charges of $4.9 million, or 29% of spending. So over 1/4 of spending. By 2017, it was anticipated at the time of this report's preparation that the federal budget would see a total expenditure of $331 billion and an expenditure to GDP ratio of about 15.6%, or under 1/6. The net federal public debt was to total $759.5 billion, resulting in a ratio of debt to GDP of 35.7% and debt service costs of $26.4 billion, which were expected to account for about 8% of federal expenditure. The finances of Canada's federal government, of course, have evolved much, as the role of the federal government has evolved in response to the needs of different eras. During the country's era of expansion, when provinces were created in Western Canada, first Manitoba in 1870, then British Columbia in 1871, and then eventually Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. When the West was opened to agricultural settlement, the federal government played a nation-building role. A huge part of that nation-building role was the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railways, whose last spike was completed in 1885. It established the framework for a national economy, particularly by subsidizing the construction of a transcontinental railway linking East and West. During periods of extreme threats to national security, especially the First and Second World Wars, the federal government quickly asserted its fiscal dominance by creating new revenue sources and acquiring debt. Of course, for most of the 1930s, Canada struggled to overcome the very sad, very painful legacy of the Great Depression. And then the Canadian federal government became more activist, started to build the welfare state, and continued that after the Second World War. And there was an absence of more concerted fiscal discipline, which both major parties of that time, both the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives, were guilty. And then the economic growth started to slow down in the early 1970s, partly as a result of the first oil crisis. And again, there was a recession in the early 1980s, although a short one. And then around 1990, the Canadian economy slowed down and entered a few years of recession. And then there was that debt crisis, which interestingly the Liberals tackled under Jean Chrétien and especially Paul Martin Jr. So it can't be argued from a historical viewpoint that the Liberals have always been a fiscally more irresponsible party than the Conservatives and the former Progressive Conservatives at the federal level, or even at the provincial level, or the municipal level. The important policy decisions are when to spend, what to spend it on, how much to spend, and how to pay for the spending. Getting the wrong answer to any of these questions has fiscal implications. And of course, in democracies such as Canada, the politicians have to essentially sell their programs to the voters to get at least a sufficient plurality of the voters into their side in order to have a functioning majority government. Or in a presidential system such as the one of the United States, most Latin American countries and many, if not most, Asian and African republics, essentially the presidential candidates have to sell their programs to the voters. Much too often this takes forms, such wicked forms as essentially vote buying. And it exists even in the well-established Western democracies such as Canada and the United States and most European countries and Australia and New Zealand. While there is relatively little downright open bribery in elections, contrary to, for example, here in the Philippines, in many, if not most, other Asian countries that have free and fair and regular elections, many, if not most, African countries, and many, if not most, Latin American countries, and possibly even several of the smaller Oceanian countries, leaving aside Australia and New Zealand, which are highly developed Western-style countries in that region or continent of the world. So essentially it means promising additional benefits or increased benefits, tax relief, and so forth to those voters who support the politicians want to get, especially if they either want to be re-elected to government or to the presidency, or they want to capture the government and or the presidency. and then essentially claiming that there will be some selective tax increases, but not affecting those people who support the would-be members of the next government or would-be presidents would like to get. And then that there would be elimination or reduction of wasteful spending and so forth. Closing of tax loopholes, but the persons, the voters who support those politicians want to get, would not really have to pay for those allegedly increased benefits, social and other benefits, or tax reductions. So, for example, the Canadian Conservatives will have to show a credible plan on how they want to tackle the worsening pollution of Canada's environment, if they want to scrap the federal carbon tax, as they have promised so vocally to do. How are they going to cover otherwise the revenue generated by the carbon tax? How are they going to pay for the tax cuts which they almost certainly will promise to at least some targeted groups of voters? How are they going to apportion the inevitable spending cuts or cuts in the rate of federal spending increase so as not to hurt the most vulnerable people, such as the long-term unemployed and poor, other people on welfare? So that's going to be a major challenge for them, including Ms. Rempel. And I'm going to quote from the last paragraph of this document before the appendix. Given the surge in deficit financing at the federal level currently underway in the wake of the 2016 budget, yes, I will admit the Liberals were already in power, but the Conservatives had better remember that also under their latest over 9 years in the federal government, the federal debt started to rise again. And there was that largest deficit in absolute terms in the Canadian history at the federal level, over $55 billion. So some 3 times more, actually over 3 times more than the current budget deficit. One wonders if the lessons of the 1990s have already been forgotten. While interest rates remain at historic lows, economic growth is also low, making the case for fiscal restraint. The progress made in bringing the ratio of federal net debt to GDP below 40% will be largely squandered or wasted if we allow debt to once again grow uncontrollably, and especially if we essentially try to buy the voters' support by lowering taxes and increasing spending irresponsibly. And this is something that governments of whatever ideological color they have been guilty of time and again. Not always. Thank God, not always. Unfortunately, there is one major industrialized country in the world that has a chronic surplus budget, Norway, because of its large revenues from offshore oil exploration. But take care, and God bless you.